Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so a couple interesting things regarding some of the leading progressive candidates running for Congress and Senate popped up over the last day. So Kat Abughazaleh, it was pointed out by Dropsite News, had a foreign policy advisor who was offering some really weird answers on questions that her campaign was getting about like what her foreign policy positions are on like Ukraine, Taiwan, etc. She essentially had a guy on her team who was saying that she was strongly interventionist and was making these very detailed arguments about about essentially like almost preemptive, but definitely hawkish military action that Kat Abughazaleh, the progressive candidate for a Congress seat in Illinois, supports. So she has since come out and said that she doesn't support those positions and that guy had been fired. So I'll get to that on the back end. But I also wanted to talk about Graham Platner a little bit here, mainly just because he was interviewed by Tim Heidecker, who did a pretty good job interviewing him. It was an interesting interview where he also allowed some callers to ask Graham Platner some questions, which is interesting. I've never quite seen that. So that led to an interesting exchange of him being pressed about the tattoo. There also was an incident. He retweeted some Nazi account on Twitter in making a point against war with Iran. So that has caused the whole tattoo thing to be back in the news for him, and Janet Mills is trying to take advantage of that. So I wanted to go over this interview with Platner to talk a little bit more about this issue and what I think about it at this point. I addressed this pretty early on when the tattoo thing originally happened and haven't talked much about Platner since then, but I want to talk a little bit more about it here because I think this exchange is interesting, and I think there's some interesting questions here, and there's ways that I think Platner can explain some of this stuff better. And maybe he doesn't need to, because he frankly is doing quite well in Maine, and my position on Platner is that like if the people of Maine like him and elect him, then let them do it. It doesn't really make sense to get in the way, because Janet Mills and Susan Collins would both be worse. I think ultimately it's better if Platner wins, even if he is the total fraud that people suspect that he might be. And I'll get to that later. There's room for disagreement on that, but I'll get into all that. So here is the interview between Tim Heidecker and Graham Platner, as well as a caller into the show.
You were against the Iraq War.
Yes.
And then you joined the Marines.
Yes.
And then became a combat.
Yeah, I was in the infantry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you did some nasty shit, I imagine.
Yeah, I mean, I was outside of Fallujah in 05. I fought in Ramadi in 06.
Right.
They were very violent deployments.
Now I knew, because I'm about 10 years older than you, but you knew that was an unjust war.
Yes.
Before you joined.
Yeah.
And what's that thought process? And where is there must be some regret, some feeling of, talk about.
Yeah. For reasons I can't explain, since I was about 2 years old, I wanted to be a soldier.
Sure.
And I don't know why that
probably watching Cobra or Predator on TV.
And I grew up playing with G.I. Joes, but it was also deeper. Into high school, I've always been a big history buff, and I was really into the Civil War. I was really into the Second World War, and I kind of just, I don't know, took off for whatever reason. But I also had an element of just frankly, I would say, childish idealism, where even though I thought the war was bad, and I was against it, and I protested it, I did everything I could to stop it, when it came, I still had this sense that I had a duty. Do
you think there was that post 9/11 patriotism? I mean, that was big running through people I knew, for sure.
There definitely was, but for me, it was twofold. It was one...
Adventurism?
It was very much. I also had this sort of deeper feeling that maybe, and I don't believe this anymore, but at the time I definitely did, that I knew that I was a good person. And I knew that if I went, no matter how bad this whole thing was, if I was there on the ground, where the violence is happening, that I could maybe do some good.
Right.
And I think... It doesn't
work that way.
It does in the very detailed sense. Like, I feel like in many ways I did get to do that.
Right.
But the greater project is so flawed. and so brutal,
Yeah.
and brings so much violence.
How do you sleep knowing what you did to the people of Iraq?
I have problems with it.
Yeah.
I mean, there is a no.
So you have regret and
I do. I will say I am very lucky. My platoon commander, the people I served with, were for the most part very good men.
Right.
And we did essentially do our best in a horrible situation.
So there are
Graham, just wanted to press you a little more, about the tattoo. You do continually refer to it as a skull and crossbones, and I would just like to ask you, as a World War II buff, if you know what they call that symbol, if you know what the name of it is.
I do now. It's I've read, it's a Totenkopf, and I have read.
So what do you mean you do now? Because if you're a World War II history buff, I mean, that was like, you ever seen Indiana Jones, or like, it was in a lot of movies, you know what I mean? So
and I was well aware that they used a similar looking thing.
No, Graham, you have to admit it's not a similar looking thing. It's the same thing.
Oh yeah.
And
no, it's
so
like when put.
You keep sort of dodging around it, but
I'm not trying to dodge.
I just would like you to admit that you got a Nazi tattoo and just apologize instead of saying it could be interpreted that way. I
can't because I didn't.
Your argument is that he went into the tattoo shop and knowingly picked a Nazi symbol to be tattooed on.
Anyone who's even remotely a World War II buff knows what that is. It's not just a skull and crossbones.
Can I admit something? I consider myself a history buff. I like history. I was not personally aware of that. So I'm not trying to be argumentative, but.
Well, I do believe you on that, Tim, but I will say that, I don't think it's that hard to apologize for a tattoo, and there has not really been an apology. There's just been I'm sorry if it resembles a hate symbol. You know what I'm saying?
But again, I'm not going to apologize for something that I didn't know about or do. And the moment that we found out, the moment that it was clear, and I was kind of putting it in that context, I got it covered because I don't want that on my body. And
you had it for 18 years, bro.
Yeah, I know, exactly.
Yeah, and I think he's spoken on it, and you can decide to not believe him.
Yeah, so Tim does a pretty good job with this interview here. He comes in strong, talking about the Iraq War, and asks a very good question that I have not heard Platner pressed on, which is he opposed the Iraq War and then joined the Marines. And so everything that we know about his military service in the Iraq War is after he initially opposed it. He says he protested it, he did everything he could to stop it, and then he went to fight the war, which just seems weird. And he says that it's because he believed that he was a good person, and so, the more good people involved in doing the fighting, the better it would go, which is a naive position, but I can kind of understand that. I guess the question, though, is that, there's a little bit of a lack of consistency happening with what this guy's worldview actually is. And something he consistently says is that he's a lifelong anti-fascist. He's always been an anti-fascist. He used to go to punk shows and fight Nazis, and that's a part of his upbringing. And frankly, I believe him when he says that. To me, he doesn't signal as somebody who couldn't be an anti-fascist. I can see that in him. But I guess there are certain decisions that he made throughout his life that don't quite line up with that. And another important thing to note is that we've seen documentation of his thoughts and stuff he posted on Reddit and stuff. All of that is after he went into this war conflict, and we have not seen as much from before. And it's possible that seeing any type of documentation of his beliefs, stuff he might have written, whatever, pictures, that could flesh out the fact that this is a guy who, as he said, has a lifelong history of being an anti-fascist. Now, he has done a lot of very substantial anti-fascist organizing and community organizing in Maine, and that is by far the best point in Graham Platner's favor, is that his bona fides when it comes to organizing in the community, teaching people about gun safety from a very anti-fascist perspective, and doing very serious mutual aid organizing, as well as tying that into his campaign, which is part of what has made his campaign so powerful. Those are extremely promising qualities that Platner has. Now, there's this question about the tattoo, which this person who calls in presses him about. And he has consistently maintained that this was just something they got when they were drunk, and they picked it off the wall, and it was a symbol of camaraderie between them. So the point that it comes to in this exchange is that this person is saying there's no way you didn't know what that was, so just admit that you knew what it was, and then we can move on. Now, Platner is flatly saying, I didn't. When he says I can't apologize for something I didn't do, he's saying I did not knowingly get a Nazi tattoo. So that's where I want to dig into a little bit more, because his story has been pretty one-dimensional when it comes to the tattoo thing, the tattoo parlor. But the question for me is, he says that they just got it as a thing and none of them knew what exactly it was. So the point is that there's a culture going on here, obviously, where they wanted to not only just get a tattoo and not only just get something that kind of bonds them as brothers in arms or whatever, but they ended up getting this symbol that has serious implications. And so I guess the question to Graham Platner would be, and this is occasionally these podcasts actually reach the people that I'm talking about, so this would be a good question to get him to answer at some point, would be, how can you make people believe that if you had known that was a Nazi tattoo at the time, you wouldn't have gotten it? Because if your bond with your friends was so important to you that you would get a symbol like that, you're drunk and whatever, then at what point would you have decided, I'm going to actually refuse to get this tattoo? It doesn't really seem like that was the vibe of the moment. And within that, then can't we, because this person kind of approaches making a good point in this clip where they say, you're referring to it as a skull and crossbones, and then Graham Platner says, well, I knew they used symbols like that. So that means that there's like a vague sense of recognition, right? There are symbols of all kinds like that are used in all kinds of ways, especially in military circles. And so to an extent, Graham Platner embraced that culture and, wanted to feel one with his brothers. So maybe they didn't have bad intentions in getting that tattoo. But I guess, and this is an out that I'll give him as well, is that, part of the problem here is that if you, by joining the military, were getting weirdly groomed into this Nazi, even if none of you knew that that was a Nazi tattoo, all of you still ended up perpetuating Nazi culture by getting it, right? And so where exactly is the cultural misstep there? And can you see why it's a little bit hard for people to believe that in that cultural context, it was 100% an accident? And what you can do in order to explain your way out of that is to explain what it would look like for a soldier in your position to refuse to get a tattoo like that, and to make the distinction of that is an unacceptable tattoo to get on your body. And because right now there are soldiers out there who are not only, getting tattoos like that with their friends without knowing what they are, but are being pressured to get symbols like that tattooed on them. So if we are going to create a version of the US military that is less openly fascistic and Nazi-esque, we're going to have to do some intense denazification of the culture of the military. And that tattoo that you got and the conditions that led to it is part of that process that's going to have to happen. And so get more specific about how that conversation should have gone down in the tattoo parlor that would have prevented you having that symbol on your body, is what I would say to Graham Platner, because maybe that can give us some more context into what type of person you are, not just your history of anti-fascism supposedly, but your personality in that moment that you could have used to say, actually, I'm going to refuse that, rather than saying, I'm going to put aside my vague discomfort with a symbol like that because I want to indulge in this camaraderie. And it's really not that much of a stretch for people to believe that you did know what that symbol was and you chose to ignore your better sense about it because of the sense of camaraderie, and because you never had any reason to get it covered up before you ran for Senate. So anyway, getting to this thing about Kat Abughazaleh, and then I'll wrap that up. So Kat, like I said, apparently had this foreign policy advisor who was sending out emails on her behalf in response to questions about her foreign policy beliefs, in which he was characterizing her as a staunch interventionist. I believe some of this language also appeared on her campaign website. Essentially, pretty aggressive action in opposition of China when it comes to Taiwan, but also stuff about, America should support intervention in favor of democracy in Venezuela and Iran, etc., which is essentially just backing up Trump policy. So that raised some eyebrows. Dropsite caught this, and this guy's name was Ben Mermel, and he apparently was also pro-Israel, or was at a pro-Israel rally at some point. So here is what Kat Abughazaleh had to say in response to all of this, and then I'll tie these things together and wrap it all up with what's going on right now.
Today, reporting revealed an email sent by someone on my staff detailing my foreign policy. The answers surprised a lot of people, including myself. I want to be really clear, I did not know of that email's existence, and I would not have approved the language in said email. I was also not aware of certain aspects of this individual's background, and they are no longer on our staff. First off, the email describes me as an interventionist, which is not true. I have no idea why he would say that. I have never described myself as an interventionist. I am anti-war, anti-genocide, anti-imperialism, and anti-intervention. I want to add an initial caveat, and that's that military intervention is an absolute last resort. We need to lead with diplomacy. We shouldn't force regime change. And especially post-Trump, we need humane foreign policy. This means public diplomacy, the reinstitution and expansion of USAID, and reparations to the global south, particularly focused on renewable energy and infrastructure. Now, my leading principle in international affairs is the right to self-determination. When it comes to Ukraine, I believe we should continue arming the Ukrainian people. Wars of aggression are illegal. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a war of aggression. That is an international crime. Putin is a despot, and he will not stop with Ukraine. We can support Ukraine by providing arms, ideally paid for through the seizure of Russian oligarch assets, but not with US troops on the ground. Similarly, I believe that politically we should adhere to the One China policy, but we should also eliminate strategic ambiguity when it comes to aiding Taiwan so that way it can defend itself without putting US boots on Taiwanese soil. The last thing any of us want is a war with China. This is an effort to make sure that doesn't happen.
Yeah, so she's basically saying she only supports intervention as a last resort, which is a pretty common sense position. Was pretty clear to me that that would be what her position was, but it seems like this guy took her position on Taiwan, which is to say that America should be less vague about the fact that we support Taiwan and would support Taiwan in the event of an attack from China, rather than being ambiguous about that. And it seems like he extrapolated that to say that she was an interventionist on many other issues. So the question is why he would do that, what exactly his intentions were, as well as raising some questions about her judgment in hiring this person. She said he's fired, and I think the positions that she takes to clarify herself in this instance are solid. But I guess this leads to a general observation in the case of both of these candidates, and really candidates across the board. Culture comes into this, and the culture of the people you surround yourself with and the people that you hire is a huge aspect of like what policy gets done. And I mean, imagine if Kat was sitting in office, she would need people to inform her about what these issues are. So if she had somebody like this working for her, that would slant the information that she was getting about whether or not she should vote yes or no on an issue like that. So that's a serious problem. And I think in the case of both of these candidates, people shouldn't necessarily take the doomer pill. I know people feel how they feel about Graham Platner, and he's a sketchier case for sure. But I think in his case, even if he ends up being a complete flop or totally reverses course, electing him over Janet Mills or Susan Collins would be a win in the face of Zionist Democrats. It would be a win for the movement. So I think that, like I've said with Graham Platner, it makes sense if the people of Maine are going to elect him to let that happen because it's a better option than Janet Mills. In the case of Kat Abughazaleh, I think she's still definitely worth supporting. But this issue of how we can culturally address some of this stuff so that, you know, people like that aren't working on the staff in the first place. He seems like there was some kind of infiltrating type of intention there. He wanted to cast Kat's positions as interventionists because that's what he believed. And he was making very detailed arguments about the types of intervention that he felt would, I don't know, prevent world conflict or maybe secure the type of wins that he wanted to see. And he was attributing that to Kat Abughazaleh. So the question with Graham Platner, if you've made the type of bad decisions that you've made, not just getting this tattoo, but also retweeting a random Nazi Twitter account, which, to be fair, Twitter shows everybody Nazi accounts at this point, so it's really not that outlandish, but it doesn't help. And it's not that hard to imagine, given those scandals, that Graham Platner at some point would hire somebody that does something weird like that. So how culturally can we prevent that? And we have to recognize at leftists that we have not pervaded a culture in this nation that prevents this sort of thing from happening. A culture that is strong enough to weed out weird beliefs and outliers within the movement. And I think everybody in America is very idiosyncratic by nature and is a strange amalgamation. Even Kat Abughazaleh used to be a Republican. She was a Marco Rubio Republican in 2016, and now she's running to the left as a progressive. So, I think that this is just a lot that we have to deal with. And even if some of these people end up being frauds, it still makes sense to elect as many people as possible on the basis that they are running on, because that will continue the political pressure in that direction and continue to allow the movement to build. I think that what would damage the movement is candidates like this not winning or self-destructing in some sense, rather than them winning and then being spoilers or something like that. Because the base of people that elected Graham Platner, even if Graham Platner completely rejects all of his previously held positions, the base that elected him is still going to want those things and is going to react to that angrily. So he might not care as a senator, but it's only going to continue the movement in Maine to achieve more actual left-wing positions. And so it's better for Graham Platner to win, regardless of what his personality is. And I feel the same with Kat Abughazaleh to a greater extent. So I guess I'll leave that at that. But it's very important for these candidates to be held to a pretty high standard when it comes to foreign policy, given the fact that Trump is going to enter us into all kinds of global conflicts, including now we're seeing that with Iran. And so it's good that we have candidates at the forefront who we can trust to oppose that policy, at least with their words. But how are they creating a culture of their own staffing and policy behind the scenes that is actually going to prevent the same type of mistakes that we've seen in the past of people being misinformed and consistently voting in favor of U.S. intervention, regardless of what the consequences are?
Me too close to, too much to do. The mission is too crucial. Shout it out from the rooftops until I lose vocals. Who gon' take it there? 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 Electricity, 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 electricity.